This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, everyone, we're just getting everyone in from the waiting room. Thank you for being patient. While we get everyone in, I'm just gonna begin by our introduction. So hello and welcome to episode 5. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of the speaker series. And Digging In is a series of live presentations with scholars from around the country, co-sponsored by the RS Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are going to begin with the land acknowledgement for the land that the Peabody Institute and its school, Phillips Academy, are on. Phillips Academy occupies the land of the Pennacook and Patuxet people and the land of the contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. We honor all Indigenous people who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. We acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities. And we understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. And we commit to interrogating the histories of and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy and beyond. So join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through June for our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you are enjoying our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you outstanding programming through support of viewers like you. So today we are excited to welcome Kaitlyn Ball. Kaitlyn graduated with a master's in historical archaeology from the best place there ever is, University of Massachusetts, Boston in 2021. Kaitlyn's research focused on connecting parasite and environmental data to medicinal artifacts and historical documentation. And she currently works as an archaeologist at Gettysburg National Military Park doing historical archaeology research and excavation. You can see her lovely National Park uniform on. And during and at the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we will give our speaker time to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding we might not get to all of them. So Kaitlyn, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to share my research with everyone today. Today I will be talking about archaeoparasitology and using my research as an example. Let me get started on the slides. So, epidemic diseases were studied by those in medicine during the 18th century, but common diseases that the colonists dealt with in their everyday life rarely received attention. The colonists were well aware of encounters with various parasitic worms and diseases during this era, but lacked a basic understanding of how infections could be contracted. Everyday activities in such an urban setting would create environments for parasite eggs to easily spread, as geoparasites spend part of their life cycle in soil, enter the human host, are then expelled through feces. These parasites do not cause death in healthy adults, but can contribute to a weakened immune system. And archaeologically, the eggs of internal parasites have been well preserved in contexts containing human night soil, such as privies, and can be used to indicate disease. Intestinal parasites are an ideal proxy for health because they are a common cause of disease in historic populations. Most investigations of health do not use parasite analysis, and very few cases focus on medical practices implemented in response to disease, which has more commonly been examined through analysis of material culture or occasionally botanical remains. From the start of Boston and into its increase in population, it steadily becomes a crowded urban space, and the need for health and sanitation measures becomes a necessity, which will be obvious as I talk about my analysis of 2 archaeological sites in Boston, the Parker House Privy and the Town Dock. Originally a port that served as a commercial center in the 17th century, the Town Dock Inlet collected trash over time and was eventually filled in for sanitation reasons in the 18th century. The most recent excavation of the Town Dock took place in 2010 with a 10-foot by 10-foot unit divided into subquadrants. The excavation, let me go back real quick. The excavation stopped at 11 feet below surface, exposing a waterlogged timber context representing elements of landmaking structures and providing excellent preservation. The 13 strata landfill deposit provided a rich assemblage of personal artifacts, botanical and faunal remains, and preservation of parasite eggs. Parasite analysis was not a part of the 2010 Faneuil Hall research plan, but sediment was retained for the processing and analysis at a later time. In 2019, city archaeologist Joe Bagley led an excavation at 23 Unity Street in the north end of Boston at the Parker Emery House. This house was sold in 1725 to a wealthy blacksmith, Caleb Parker, who lived at the property with his wife and 4 children. A historic deed drawing of the rear lot from 1827 contained a labeled privy where the yard remained undeveloped to the present. Excavations located an intact 18th century yard, a mid-18th century double barrel privy, which I will refer to as features 5 and 6, and they were lined with clay, as well as a 19th century privy labeled in the deed drawing, which is known as feature 2. Reinhard is responsible for the term archaeoparasitology, as well as the methods that serve as the basis for many case studies, established through previous work done in the UK. What I will be focusing on today in this talk is the intestinal parasites whipworm, or trichuris, and roundworm, which is ascaris. These are the 2 most common species of human host parasites that are reported in archaeological contexts. The environment and conditions of the archaeological context plays a significant role in what species of parasite eggs may be preserved, but excavations of privies tend to have high levels of preservation. Urban Boston in the 18th century provided a perfect environment for infections to spread, as night soil from privies was used to fertilize crops and gardens. The 14 town dock samples I chose to process represent the strata that appeared to have the best preservation, were from the 18th century or contained macrobotanical remains, such as berry seeds, that may indicate the presence of human feces. From the Parker House excavation, I processed 10 soil samples. 7 were from features 5 and 6, which are the 18th century double barrel privy, 1 sample from the clay liner, and 2 samples from feature 2, which again is the 19th century privy. A palynology derived method using hydrochloric acid, swirl sedimentation, and hydrofluoric acid achieves the best result to identify and tabulate parasite eggs, as widely accepted in the community of study of archaeoparasitology. Prepared slides were scanned at 400 times magnification under a microscope. And parasite eggs were identified and counted by the time 100 Lycopodium spores added as a control were counted in each of my samples. Taking a look at the results yielded from my study, 12 out of 14 town dock samples contained preserved parasite eggs. From strata 13, my sample 16 recovered the highest density of parasite eggs from the town dock samples at 362.6 ova per gram of soil. Both Ascaris and Trichuris eggs were present. And this context was a mix of household, natural, and privy waste deposits. At a context level, results were as expected for the town dock excavation, where samples associated with a fire in 1761 being of the lowest parasite egg densities, and samples with macrobotanical remains and good preservation contained the highest densities. At the town dock, a greater proportion of Trichuris ova was present, which may be expected for 18th century sites made up of field context. Out of the 10 Parker House samples I processed, 8 contained parasite eggs and 2 did not. One of those 2 that did not being from the clay Privy liner. Sample 3, the deepest of the feature 5 barrel, resulted in the highest total density of this feature. Identified in sample 3 were Ascaris trichuris and Tinea, which are tapeworm eggs, with Trichuris being the most abundant taxa. Feature 6 contained the second barrel of the 18th century Privy. As discussed with the samples in feature 5, feature 6 also resulted in evidence for the greatest density of parasite eggs at the lowest depth of the Privy barrel. With the density of 1,696.07 parasite eggs per gram, sample 8 resulted in the highest total parasite density from the Parker House excavation. And feature 2, the 19th century Privy, resulted in very small trace amounts of Ascaris eggs. Compared to parasite densities reported in other New England case studies, the town dock samples had Trichuris eggs density levels similar to 18th century non-Privy deposits in Albany. And the Parker Privy had a surprisingly low total density, with less than half the density of levels reported at an excavation done at a 18th century site in Newport, Rhode Island, the Brown Privy. There was an interesting comparison between the Parker House 18th century and 19th century Privies, where twice the density is observed in the 18th century Privy. Overall, the parasite densities from the Parker House Privies are quite low when compared with data from other New England Privy sites. Because both Privies seem to have ideal preservation, the greater presence of parasites in the 18th century Privy may be attributed to the household having higher levels of infection. And then, consistent with the nature of historic fill deposits, the town dock samples are reflective of communal waste patterns containing a variety of materials from households and businesses. Therefore, the samples included a low concentration of human waste. And moving into a look at the material culture and medicinal artifacts. So in addition to historical documentation, including advertisements and medical handbooks, I reviewed case studies analyzing artifacts relating to medical practices to provide my research with background on material culture. And items that are likely to appear in archaeological contexts include ceramic and glass medical containers, cupping jars, pint pots, mortar and pestles, vial corks, and glass stoppers and syringes. And then items such as surgical instruments that would have been rarely replaced are much less likely to be expected in the archaeological record. And although several cases that studied 18th century New England privy deposits also include an interpretation of analyzed parasites, none really make a connection between the medicinal artifacts and parasite data. Show some examples. So early glass pharmaceutical bottles display a very prominent kick-up, such as the vial from feature 5 from the Parker Emery House Privy, which is on the bottom right over here. Commonly found on archaeological sites are small cylindrical glass vials. Found at the town dock in various strata are examples of Aqua vials, and this wide flattened lip and small kick-up suggests that these vials were manufactured in the early to mid 18th century. Similarly, an aqua-covered vial from the Parker House in the 18th century Privy, found in feature 6, which appears to be free-blown here in the middle. These small vessels were used to distribute medicines from apothecaries and doctors for the patient to use the medicine in their households. And because the vials were used for all types of medicines and often reused, it is not possible to conclude from these vials alone what they might have contained. Now, one of my favorite artifacts, one of the embossed medicine bottles excavated in Strata 5 of the town dock is Turlington's Balsam of Life, a patent bottle version which was produced in 1754. A patent medicine maker, Robert Turlington of London, made this distinct violin-shaped bottle to prevent imitations from other vendors. And this liquid medicine started off containing 27 ingredients and an alcohol base, but the number of ingredients shortened over time. During the 18th century, many patent medicines sold were considered to be quackery by the general public, and they boasted a wide range of uses. Specifically regarding the treatment of intestinal parasites, the ingredients in Turlington's Balsam of Life that were consistent with medical recipes found in historical documentation are St. John's wort as a dewormer and aloe as a purgative. Some other related artifacts found. I also examined personal hygiene artifacts from my assemblages, such as this Charleston ware chamber pot excavated at the Parker House. Other personal hygiene artifacts found at both sites included toothbrushes, hairbrushes, and combs. The Turlington's bottle, along with the glass medicine vials, suggests that popular early proprietary medicines were available in the port city of Boston at the town dock and sold at local apothecaries such as Boylston's Town Square shop. The Charleston ware chamber pot also demonstrates that the Parker family purchased and used locally available wares. Although a majority of the medicine bottles and vials recovered do not provide evidence of what they once contained, they align with what material culture was expected from the 18th century sites with unembossed and labelless bottles. And written sources such as medical publications, letters, journals, apothecary formularies, and advertisements provide key information to aid in the interpretation of recovered artifacts and parasite samples. I focused on documents written by people considered to be medical professionals near Boston, and paleography methods outlined in guides and tutorials from the National Archives in the United Kingdom, and a guide to apothecary measures from the University of Michigan, aided in 16 transcriptions that I completed. During the transcribing process, I kept a list of terms and ingredients that I came across and created a spreadsheet citing definitions, chemical makeups of ingredients, and then uses or cures. For example, Benjamin Wadsworth of Boston kept this book containing a collection of remedies and treatments. The transcription reads, Mrs. Bailey of Roxbury, her worm powder, 1 ounce of jalap, 1/4 ounce of rhubarb, 1/4 ounce of Mercurius dulcis, all powdered. And the worm powder ingredients in this recipe are fairly standard, with jalap acting as a purgative and rhubarb as a laxative. Jalap from the morning glory family would have been imported from Mexico, and the roots were used as a strong cathartic drug. Mercury chloride is also more commonly known as calomel. Calomel became popular as a cure-all to cleanse the body, an increasingly abused drug in the 18th century. And this recipe for worm powder is a significant example, as many recipes in Wadsworth's account came from women. A majority of domestic recipes were recorded and prepared by women of a household and passed along through generations and community networks. A common 18th century ailment, such as worms, could have been treated at home if the ingredients were available, especially convenient if the household was of middle or lower class and may not have been able to afford a doctor's visit. Households, communities, and practicing physicians often use guidebooks to learn the preparation of herbal remedies. 18th century Boston apothecaries Elizabeth Greenleaf and Boylston made extensive use of Culpeper's Complete Herbal, written in 1653. In the herbal, treatments for worms include the herbs commonly found in the recipes and discussed and widely used in the 17th and 18th century, such as scammony, vervain, and St. John's wort. Many colonial household gardens in New England contained common herbs for medicinal purposes, as seen in this table from the Town Doc report. Specifically for the treatment of intestinal parasites, this site had several plants that were historically documented to treat worms. Purslane, a weedy plant and common colonial herb, was used as a vermifuge for children and would have naturally grown around Town Dock. Chenopodium, although the species of Chenopodium is unknown in this context, could have been worm seed. We don't know for sure. And then St. John's wort and vervain also had uses as a vermifuge. I have a fun little advertisement here. This Massachusetts Centennial newspaper provides insight to the goods available at local apothecaries. And this was found in a 1789 Boston directory, where Dr. Peters is listed as a physician just a few blocks away from where the Town Dock was. And this advertisement shows that an apothecary in Boston allowed for access to imports where the colonists could purchase medicines familiar from home. The Turlington's balsam, one of the proprietary medicines actually listed in this advertisement, matches the early embossed patent bottle recovered from the Town Dock discussed earlier, furthering evidence that patents and advertisements of proprietary medicines impacted urban Boston and were available specifically among merchants and upper class consumers. Demonstrated through the analysis that I carried out, Reinhardt's article written in 2017 argues that parasite samples destroyed from the record are only of value if they are interpreted alongside the archaeological context to help address a specific research question. The data I analyze are amplified within the context I have given the data and the research conducted, where each of my data sets, the parasite samples, material culture, and historical documentation, coexist and complement each other, working to form a narrative. From what I examined in the archaeological record, it is clear the public surrounding Town Dock and the Parker household attempted to maintain good personal hygiene by using medicines to treat ailments, disposing of their garbage and waste in a designated area, and cleaning out privies as needed. Even if these measures were not entirely effective, the acknowledgement that poor sanitation led to disease and bad health was progress from the very limited regulations in place during the late 17th century. And evident from the Parker family household assemblage and Boston's population that disposed items into the Town Dock fill, material culture presents indicators and ways to treat health ailments that likely were not available to all. The boom of shops and businesses in the 18th century Boston cultured a push for marketing, leading to popularity and a shift toward these commercial medicines. And it's unclear if the preference for medicines across both of these sites were strictly commercial or homemade, but I argue that it is likely a combination of both. However, the indication of commercially sold medicines in the archaeological record allow for a conclusion that increasing urbanization and progress for establishing rigor in the field of medicine in 18th century Boston is contemporary with the documentation and the records that I have analyzed. Before I open it up to questions, I'd just like to thank my graduate program at the University of Massachusetts Boston and the Fisk Center for all their help with this research, as well as Joe Bagley, City Archaeologist of Boston, and Alicia Parisi, and everyone at the National Park Service at NMSC. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kaitlyn. That was really exciting. So yeah, everyone, you can send in your questions either through the Q&A function, or you can put it in the chat function and everything. I have a question first, though, is what got you studying the parasites? Like, how did you get this as your thesis project?
You know, I always liked the aspect of looking at medicine archaeologically. Always my favorite artifacts are the medicine bottles. And so I think the parasites were just another aspect of how we can look at disease. And it was disgusting and it thrilled me.
I love it. So we have a question from Wesley. Is it possible to contract parasites, a parasite-based disease, when excavating a privy?
So actually, the archaeological remains of these parasite eggs, the eggs only could be contracted through the soil probably 1 to 2 years after they're initially deposited. So luckily for us, these are a little more than 1 to 2 years old.
Though I will say, Wesley, and to everyone else, I do know sometimes that when you're excavating cemeteries or graves that have disease, because like there was out on one of the Boston Harbor Islands, smallpox cemetery, that can definitely still be living. So it is definitely something that that archaeologists do have to be aware of and consider and everything. So we have a sort of another question. What was the most surprising find for these 2 digs, or in your research, that you weren't sort of expecting maybe?
I think, honestly, probably I wasn't expecting to find as much similarities and cross connections between historical documentation and the materials I was looking at. I definitely got lucky to find so many intersections in my data, and I don't think I was expecting that with the looking at the recipes and the historical documentation. To me, that was the most interesting part. And even finding parasite eggs in my soil at all. I was lucky. I did go through many other sites prior to the ones I chose that did not have the preservation needed to carry out research like this.
Okay. We have a couple more questions. I'm going to combine 2 of them. So what was the structure of the privy? Did it drain, or it was enclosed? I think you sort of talked about it, but if you can talk about it more. And was the throwing out of like the vials and other ceramics and stuff into the privy, was that common for the time? So
yeah, so the privy itself was a double barrel privy, and what that means is basically, in this case, it was 2 holes dug in the ground side by side, and in it they put a wooden barrel. So you had the 2 wooden barrels, and then they were lined with clay on the inside of the wooden barrel, which aided in the great preservation in my case. And yes, there was lots of garbage thrown in the privy. This one in particular, kitchen garbage, bones, ceramic plates that broke, glass. Pretty common to throw garbage in there
because there was no real trash pickup, right? Like, and they didn't produce trash like we think of it.
Exactly. Yeah, and although the privies probably were cleaned out from what I've seen multiple times.
What was it, the night soil men or something?
The night soil men, yeah. But yes, lots of garbage in the privies as well.
Okay. Our last question is, do you know if any of the remedies were actually effective and everything?
Some. What seems to, later on, looking at the chemical makeup of some of the ingredients in these medicines, you would have probably had more luck with the herbs and homemade preparations, opposed to getting yourself patent medicine with 20 ingredients in it, cure all. But there are definitely some herbal remedies that are still used today in parts of the world to treat parasitic infections. So.
Okay. And then we have from Nancy, there are records for Boston for night soil pickups. Yep. And then she is correct. That there is a book about concerns for archaeologists about disease. You guys can Google that. Nancy mentions that it might be Nick Bellatoni, who was the Connecticut state archaeologist, And that sounds correct to me, Nancy, but for everyone else, you know, try and Google that if you're really interested into it and everything. And I think you are correct that it was Nick Bellatoni, the Connecticut State archaeologist. But yeah, I know Ellen Birkeland, when she was the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation archaeologist, doing the Boston Harbor Islands, like the FBI had to come out and check on them because they were doing the smallpox cemetery, and like they almost had to get like inoculated for, you know, smallpox and everything. So at least you don't have to worry about getting whipworm or anything like that. One last question we have, or two more. So did they use, and I'm sorry, Deborah, I'm gonna mess this up, Genetian violet, or is that more recent? And then also, what kind of diseases did these parasites cause? Like, what were people experiencing by having them?
Okay, for the first question, yes, I have read historical documentation. Yes, that is an ingredient that was used in recipes. Not specifically in the ones that I looked at in Boston. I'm sure there are multiple others in Boston that could have, but looking at the historical documentation, in the location that I looked, if you broaden it out to New England, definitely I saw that in many documents. And then what's the second question?
What were the symptoms of these parasites?
Right. So it depended on the case of, I guess, the disease load, how infected the person was. It was much more severe in young children, it seemed. And typically it would cause upset stomach, and you know, the more you feed into the cycle of not knowing what's causing, you know, eating your vegetables without washing them, stuff like that, upset stomach, vomiting, diarrhea, it could lead into the more worms that got into your system. It could lead to more serious infections, causing problems with, I read a whole bunch of crazy stuff with your brain, your lungs. It could get bad if not, if allowed to get worse. But it really varies on the specific type of infection and how bad the infection was. Lovely, I know.
Well, thank you, Kaitlyn. Those were the questions we had for you today. So thank you for joining us and speaking to us today. And thank you to all our viewers. And we look forward to seeing everyone at our next lecture, which will be Wednesday, April 6th, when we're joined by Dr. Stacy Camp, who will be speaking about the archaeology of Japanese internment camps from World War II. So thank you. And have a wonderful Wednesday, everyone.